Hello. In this video, we're going to talk about John Stuart Mill's essay on liberty. So this came out in 1859, and it's worth noting that in 1859, this was quite the cutting edge of political philosophy. Basically, the way that I would sort of describe Mill's idea here, his central contention, is it is a utilitarian approach to libertarianism. And not like US-style libertarianism, which tends to be regressive conservative ideology or regressive autocratic ideology dressed up in the rhetoric of individual liberty, actual like European-style libertarianism, which is centrally concerned with the question, how little can the government infringe upon individual freedom while still functioning as a government? And it's utilitarian. So James Mill, who is John Stuart Mill's father, was a big utilitarian thinker. Basically, the fundamental question of utilitarianism is, how do you generate the maximum amount of happiness for the maximum amount of people? So this is a big influence on John Stuart Mill as well. And so he takes these kinds of things to On Liberty. Basically, he identifies as a problem the fact that previous thinkers about representative government, we would now identify a lot of these thinkers as in the democratic tradition, though they may or may not have been. People like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, Montesquieu, people like this. Mill identifies a central problem with a lot of earlier thinking in the liberal tradition, which is that these thinkers tended to assume that once the people got to represent themselves, there would be no problems of like, they're not acting in their own interest. The idea in Locke and Rousseau and people like this is basically, once power is invested in the people, they will be able to act with reasonable self-interest. So what the people do with power will be in the service of the people and will not be shaped by the interests of particular forces or factions or whatever it is. Mill, who actually had the benefit of living in a society that had roughly representative government. I mean, in 1832, Britain established pretty much universal male suffrage. And so by 1859, Mill had a sense of what it was like to live in a mostly representative system. He says that's actually wrong. Like there's some big major limitations to that assumption. And so that's his sort of jumping off point. But the other big jumping off point here, he says this in the introductory section, though this proposition is not likely to be contested in general terms, the practical question, where to place the limit, how to make the fitting adjustment between individual independence and social control, is a subject on which nearly everything remains to be done. All that makes existence valuable to anyone depends on the enforcement of restraints upon the actions of other people. So this is Mill's central question in On Liberty. Where do we place that line? We value individual liberty, and there are social benefits to having individual liberty, but society as such also requires a certain degree of control, a certain degree of sacrificing individual liberty for the common good. How do we determine where that line is? And that's the thing that preoccupies Mill. Now, in On Liberty, he comes to a fairly straightforward, I think, conclusion about this. Basically, the overall argument that Mill makes in On Liberty, which in this Oxford World Classics edition is about 100 pages long, if you read just the introductory section, which is, I think, about 17, yeah, actually less than 17, because it starts on page 5. So it's about 12 pages long. You actually get the central idea that Mill argues for in the introductory section, and then the rest of it is largely elaboration, explanation, justification, and exemplification of this key principle. So, what he says here, the object of this essay is to assert one very simple principle as entitled to govern absolutely the dealings of society with the individual in the way of compulsion and control, whether the means used to be physical force in the form of legal penalties or the moral coercion of public opinion. That principle is that the sole end for which mankind are warranted, individually or collectively, in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is self-protection. That the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. Or, put another way, the only part of the conduct of anyone for which he is amenable to society is that which concerns others. In the part which merely concerns himself, his independence is of right absolute. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. This gets presented in a number of different ways over the course of the essay, but the same idea drives everything that we see. We get it again about 2 pages later. The only freedom which deserves the name is that of pursuing our own good in our own way, so long as we do not attempt to deprive others of theirs or impede their efforts to obtain it. This is Mill. This is the whole thing on liberty. The rest of it is elaboration of this principle, basically. So the second section focuses on the importance of freedom of speech, expression, and the press. The third section focuses on the importance of individuality. And what's really striking, so this is the basic principle. I'll focus on that first really quickly. And then I want to tell you what's really striking about Mill's arguments about individuality. So the basic principle, as you probably got from those quotations from Mill, is that the individual should be allowed to do anything that does not harm others, even if it harms that individual, even if it is detrimental to them, even if it is bad for them in some way. They should be free to do that, provided it does not hurt others. One problem with Mill's theory is it's not always clear how easily that line can be drawn. If, for instance, it's 1859, this is unregulated industrial capitalism, and I own a factory in which people regularly lose limbs, regularly lose body parts, etc., etc., I am not doing that. I am not cutting off people's fingers or arms or feet or whatever it is, but the machines that I own and have put them into those working conditions without safety regulations, etc., are causing that damage. Am I therefore responsible for that? Should I be penalized because I've indirectly done harm to others? We could make this even more abstract, and a philosopher like Peter Singer, I think, would maybe make this objection to Mill. What if I eat more food than I actually need to survive? And as you can see, I probably do. if I'm depriving others of that food, I'm also an American, and we're probably the most wasteful society in the history of the world. If my actions, even if they are the norm for my society, deprive others of food that they need to survive, have I caused them harm in a way that should be penalized? This is a really difficult question, and it's not necessarily one that Mill is immediately prepared to answer. His focus is much more on liberty. His focus is much more on the question of direct harm or also refusing to take an action that would prevent immediate harm. So if I see someone drowning and I'm capable of saving them, and I choose not to save them because it would be inconvenient for me to get my clothing wet, then Mill says society has a responsibility to hold me accountable for that. So that's one of the things, is Mill is very clear about this. This is both a question of you cannot take actions that harm others, but you also have a social obligation. Because you are a member of society and you benefit from the protections of society, you are therefore obligated to meet the requirements of society, e.g., paying taxes, defending your nation in time of war, something like this, these kinds of things. Society has reasonable standards they can demand of the members of that society. So that's all that's the basic argument Mill is making here, basically. Anything else you get to do. If it's something, you can hold and express a stupid opinion, you can be wrong, you can be individualistic, you can do things that you know will be bad for you, or that you could reasonably be expected to know will be bad for you. And society has no right to interfere with your right to do those things. So that's Mill's central argument here. Now, one of the things that I do find really striking, incidentally, there is a bit here, it's fairly small, where Mill also puts another caveat on this, so Mill's caveats don't quite go as far as somebody like John Locke, who essentially says property owners are the only proper members of society. But Mill does have this bit, again, this is 1859, so this is not shocking, but it's still problematic from the perspective of 2022, where he basically says backwards societies, or he says society in which the race itself may be considered as in its nonage. So basically, childlike races. This, again, 1859 in Britain. You've got that imperialist racism element, but it's not really that central to Mill's essay. It's problematic because it is a fundamental assumption, but he also allows that societies develop. Now, again, this is problematic, not central to Mill argument. But the thing that I've kind of moved toward a couple of times and pulled myself back from is really the difference between Mill's philosophy and libertarianism as such. Because that basic principle that the individual should be free to do whatever they want provided they don't harm someone else, that sounds like a very libertarian principle. But the difference is Mill's utilitarianism, right? For libertarians, for libertarian philosophers, traditionally, the focus really is on individual rights. The individual should have the freedom to do what they want. The individual is the key social unit. For Mill, it's actually the opposite. Even though he has a section on liberty about individualism and the importance of individualism, for Mill, this is all about social benefit. Again, this is the utilitarian thing, the greatest good for the greatest number. What Mill argues is that giving individuals liberty is the best thing for society as a whole. Society as a whole benefits most from giving individuals liberty. So this is the key difference. The focus, again, for libertarians is on individual rights, the individual as the key subject of concern. For Mill, society as a whole is the key subject of concern. Mill is interested in how you make society work for the maximum benefit. And what he argues is that this principle of allowing people to do what they want, think what they want, say what they want, etc., provided they don't harm others or the society at large, this is the main way to maximize social utility.